what I receive when I'm in the service of another human being is greater than anything that I've ever found. And I think that that's what I would like people to know, that if you're willing to dig down in this thing and find yourself, what you'll find is a heart that's willing to give. And when you give, you receive it.
Well, hello, friends of Bill W. and other friends. You have landed on Sober Speak. My name is John M. I am an alcoholic, and we are glad you are all here, especially newcomers. Newcomers, that is, both to recovery as a whole and newcomers to this podcast. Sober Speak is a podcast about recovery centered around the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. My job here on Sober Speak is simple. My job is to provide a platform to the amazing stories of recovery all around us. Consider Sober Speak, if you will, your meeting between meetings. Please remember, we do not speak for AA or any 12-step community. We represent only ourselves. We are here to share our experience, strength, and hope with those who wish to come along for the ride. Take what you want and leave the rest at the curb for the trash man to pick up. Well, howdy, folks. That thar was the voice of Mr. Patrick B. you heard at the beginning of this episode, and you're going to hear much more from him in just a moment, and I know you're going to enjoy Patrick's story. But first things first, this episode is brought to you by Janice R. and Ben P. Janice R. and Ben P. went to our website, soberspeak.com. They clicked on the donate tab and made a contribution. Thank you so much, Janice R. and Ben P., for your generosity. This episode is for you. So, we are here at another episode of Sober Speak. I just flew in from out of town today, and boy, are my arms tired. Just kidding, that's a long joke, but it has been a very long week. But I was excited to get back in front of the microphone and record an introduction for this episode. And I just want to continue to say thank you. Thank you, thank you. I know I've said it before, but I can feel your energy through the emails, through the messages I receive on Facebook and Instagram. And I know that you are out there. I see the download numbers. I know that there are so many people listening to this. And as I said last week, it makes me feel like we are in this together doing God's work, and I'm so thankful for you guys. And I would absolutely love to reach out through this microphone and give every one of you a big physical hug. Now, I don't think that's possible yet. The technology's come a long way, but I don't think I can do that. But since I can't give you a physical hug, I'm going to give you a there you go, a virtual hug. And I know that there are going to be people out there that don't like hugs. I know you are out there, and I will respect your virtual boundaries, I guess. So just ignore that last statement. Maybe just pretend like it never happened. Anyway, it's good to be here in front of the mic again. So I was thinking on my trip back, why do I continue to do this podcast? And I just have to continue to remind myself of why I'm doing it, why I take the time out to do this. And for whatever reason, page 28 in the big book popped into my head. And I'm going to read this chapter here, this paragraph, and the quote that I was thinking of. And it says, "We in turn sought the same escape with the desperation of drowning men. What seemed at first a flimsy reed has proved to be the loving and powerful hand of God. A new life has been given us, or, if you prefer, a design for living that really works." And that quote right there, a design for living that really works, is what drives me to do this. Let me put it this way. I want people to have exposure to this design for living. When I came into AA, I was absolutely scared to death, but I did notice a core group of people right off the bat that had what I wanted. I identified with them, and I wanted to be like them. All of these people, they worked the steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, and they had a good working knowledge of the big book. I want to pass that on to others. I want to pass on what was so freely given to me with absolutely nothing expected in return. And according to my sponsor, who was part of that core group and is still my sponsor today, my only responsibility, as he put it, was to pass on that message to others. And I am so not perfect at passing it on, but I've been doing it for a few 24 hours. And I am so thankful. I have to tell you, I am so thankful for the people that went before me and the people that continue to pass it on to me today. There's a story of I hope I get this right. There's a story of a little girl who went on vacation, and she visited all the great cathedrals in Europe. And when she was in Europe and visiting these cathedrals, she looked up at the stained glass and she asked somebody who was there, who are the people in the stained glass? And they commented, those are the angels. And when she returned home from visiting those cathedrals, she was asked by her friends and family what she had done while she was on vacation. And she said that she had seen the angels. And they asked her who the angels were. And she said the angels were the people who let the light in. And that's who you all have been for me. You've not been the light, but you have been the ones who let the light in and continue to let the light in. And I am so thankful for you and for those who came before you. Keep in mind, I would appreciate you sharing this podcast with 2 or 3 family members. Either share an episode, or if it moved you, or share the podcast as a whole. It's a great way to support the show, and I truly would appreciate it. Also, remember, we have a secret Facebook group to protect anonymity, and the way you get in it is by being invited by somebody in the group already, or you can send me your email address. Send it to me at john@soberspeak.com. That's JOHN @soberspeak.com. Send me your email address that is associated to your Facebook account, and I can send you an invite. There are so many amazing like-minded friends of Bill W., Al-Anon, and other step groups in there. Also, remember, you can follow me on Instagram at SoberSpeak, all one word. I read all of my direct messages, and I would love to hear from you. We will have listener feedback at the end of this episode. But now, on to Mr. Patrick B. Enjoy. Okay, everybody, so today we are sitting here with Mr. Patrick B. from Minnesota. Can you say hello to everybody, Mr. Patrick?
Hello out there in podcast land.
So Patrick is from Minnesota. He's actually in Minnesota right now. And I think when I talked to you yesterday, you said the sun is shining and the snow is melting. Is that correct?
I saw brown grass today for the first time in months, John. We're making progress up here in the tundra.
That's great.
The sun is out again today, and it's approaching 60 degrees. So
all right, 60 degrees. Wow, that's great.
Wonderful spring day.
That's great. All right, so I know we're going to cover a lot of ground with Patrick today, so I'm just going to start out by asking you a question about. I know that you have a love, if you will, a passion for the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous and the 12 steps. And why don't we start there, and then we'll kind of go back a little from there, and we'll just kind of cover your story.
Okay. Well, I was first introduced to the 12 steps by a counselor in a 28-day treatment facility, my one and only treatment, who, after a very sort of brief intake interview, understood who he was looking at and handed me the book and looked me directly in the eyes and said, "This may be the only shot you have at any kind of a life." Which I, immediately took some offense to, but I did take the book. And that night I sat down and I began to read from the middle, like many alcoholics do. I just opened up to the middle. And it intrigued me so much what I found, and I identified with what I found, that I went back to the beginning and read almost all the way through the first 164 pages that first night. And I knew that I had found something that explained to me the nature of why I drank and used the way that I did, and also that I didn't have to do it anymore if I was willing to do the work that was in the book. Now, of course, I didn't know what that entailed at the time, but it gave me what I think the book refers to as a mustard seed of willingness. And I was intrigued. And the next AA meeting that came to the facility from AA members, I asked a guy if he would sponsor me. He agreed, and he started to show up every Saturday for the next, 3 or 4 months. And we made our way through that book. And I haven't found it necessary to pick up a drink since.
And what's your sobriety date again?
My sobriety date is December 22nd of 2003.
Right before Christmas.
Yeah, I was a Christmas baby. It was, my family has a history. I was raised in a family in which alcoholism has really racked the family. And my father had a penchant for going to detox or getting arrested in and around the holidays, and I followed suit with that. My sister, the black belt Al-Anon, can pretty much lay all of that out for you. But it was the idea that I would ruin yet another holiday with my family. That was part of the reason, and the other reason was that I was physically expiring as well.
So let's go back there a little bit. You talked about your family a little bit. Obviously,
Yep.
There's some alcoholism in the family.
Yes,
do you have one sister, at least we know of? What about brothers?
I have 2 brothers, both older. One is deceased. He died of alcoholism in my arms when I was 7 years sober. I introduced him to this way of life, but he made a decision not to avail himself of it. So I had the experience of walking him and his family through the end stages of his alcoholism, which was one of the most difficult periods of my recovery, but also just a level of grace and love that I never knew that I'd be able to experience in recovery. I was there, I was present, I was able to show up in a way for my family that I'd never been able to show up for during that very difficult time. As a young man, I watched my father drink himself to death. I was 23 when he passed. I'm 59 now. So it was, many, many years ago, but he, I at that time I knew that I would never be an alcoholic. I just knew. I was a daily drinker at that point, of course, but I was in that phase of the disease in which, I will never be like him. And I already was. I know that now. But there's a long history of alcoholism in my immediate family. I don't know much about the extended family past that. I know that my maternal grandparents were both sober people. I don't know what the drinking looked like on my father's side because I came along pretty late. my father was 45 when I was born, so there was a significant gap. I just know that he was an alcoholic, and that in my family, my mother struggled with alcohol as well. And both my brothers, my oldest brother found his way to sobriety on a different path. He hasn't had a drink in 35 years. He is not a member of AA. He went to one AA meeting at the beginning and found a way to achieve sobriety on his own. He did have a significant alcohol problem. He parked his car in his living room twice. So that'll indicate to you
that'll qualify you, huh?
that there might have been some issues. But he found his way to sobriety a long time ago, and he was actually instrumental in sort of getting me into a detox unit and treatment. In the last days of my drinking as well. He was present there as well.
So you said both your dad and your brother died of this disease.
Yes,
your brother actually in your arms.
Yes. My father died. He had a car accident. He was driving too slow. That was his penchant. He was driving too slow on a wintry night here in Minnesota, and he was overtaken by a semi and thrown into the ditch. He was under the influence at that time, but in those days you didn't, the disease wasn't as open. And so when he went to the hospital, nobody in the family revealed that he was an alcoholic. So he had broken his neck, and during surgery, he had a grand mal seizure because of the withdrawal process. And this was the next day. It was 24 hours later. They stabilized him in the emergency room, and then they decided to do surgery. And because of his withdrawals, he had a grand mal seizure on the table and was in a persistent vegetative state for the next 7 months, during which I visited him a grand total of one time, which will tell you where I was with selfishness and self-centeredness at the time. I was much
and you
more.
were 23 at the time?
I was 23 and a budding alcoholic for sure. I picked up when I was 13, and I immediately dropped out of school in order to sort of surround myself with the party lifestyle. I went to work at 14 years old so I could drink.
So, and going back to your brother again, I think you said you were 10 months sober when he passed.
I was 7 years sober.
You were 7 years. I'm sorry. Apologize.
7 years sober. Yep.
So, walk me through that experience a little bit, and with the family, and
sure.
what that meant to you.
Sure. So I remember clearly the day I got a call from my niece, his oldest child, and her name is Jamie. And Jamie called me and said that Patrick, it's getting bad with Dad. Can you please come down and just do what you can? Obviously the family knew that I had achieved a level of recovery by that time, and so I got in the car as soon as I could and drove to Omaha, where they live. He and my father had a very contentious relationship around his marriage to the woman that was the mother of his children and his wife until he died. And so he had moved to Omaha very young. I think he was about 20, 21 when he moved to Omaha. So he raised his family in Omaha. And I drove to Omaha from Minneapolis. My brother had already been diagnosed with liver failure at that point, and that began sort of a 2.5 year walk to the end for him. He was told very explicitly by many doctors that if you continue to drink, it will kill you. We have a small chance of saving you if you don't. And shortly thereafter, because when you have liver disease, your brain function is compromised to some degree. He had a slight accident with his shoulder in which he sprained or cracked his shoulder or something, and he was handed a bottle of OxyContin by a doctor who didn't realize what his addiction history was. Well, essentially that became a bottle and a pill for him, and that's what he walked out of his life with was a severe addiction to painkillers. He didn't actively drink much after that, but he did seek out the opiates pretty strongly, and that's eventually what really created the situation that killed him.
And you said you dropped out of school at 13, is that right?
I did. I dropped out of school when I was 13 years old. My friend and I was fascinated with drinking because it was all around me all the time. And on a hot summer day, a friend of mine and I got some dude in a parking lot of the liquor store up the street to buy us a 12-pack of old style beer. And nothing better than a warm old style on a hot summer day. I still remember the taste. I almost spit it out when I did. But he drank 3 of those beers that day and got sick, and I drank 9 and wobbled home from that first encounter with alcohol, wondering when I'd get to duty. And I assumed that was everybody's experience. I later read in the doctor's opinion, of course, that I had the allergy, and that it was manifest in me from the beginning. Alcohol hijacked my life the moment that I put it into my system in any quantity. And I know that now. I know that at age 13, my decisions almost, the course of my life changed that day. And that alcohol began to make those decisions, and alcoholism began to make the decisions for my life on that summer day in 1972. So, yeah.
So you drank from how many years? That's from 13 to what? When did you sober
40. I was 44 years old when I sobered up. I had a 31-year drinking career, and probably 28 of that was a daily drinker.
So obviously something got you into Alcoholics Anonymous. Was there any particular turning point that made that happen?
There was in April of 2003. The last 3 or 4 years of my drinking, obviously I was having to wake up every couple of hours and drink. I had pretty severe DTs and I would shake badly if I didn't get alcohol into my system at least every couple of hours. And for the last 2 or 3 years, maybe 3 or 4 mornings a week, I would have pretty serious chest pains as well. And when you've got one answer to life, good day you drink, bad day you drink, middling day you drink, you just drink. I would always calm those chest pains with a drink. One particular Saturday morning, I woke up and I had been on sort of even a bender that was rather epic, even for my standards at that point. And I hadn't eaten in a couple of days, and I was very hungry. And I went to a local Denny's restaurant just a couple of blocks up the street. And I lived in a neighborhood. One of the things that I never did was get a driver's license. I didn't have a driver's license until I got to recovery, and I never drove a car because when I was young, I saw my friends going to jail and for drinking and driving. And it wasn't the idea of going to jail that bothered me. It was the fact that maybe I wouldn't get to drink if I did go to jail. So I never got a driver's license when I was young. So I lived in a neighborhood in which I could walk to everything I could find. I could walk to my job. I could walk to the mailbox. And this will just indicate to you the level in which alcohol was really constructed my life, and alcoholism, that all of my decisions about where I lived and in the neighborhood, in the city, and where I worked in a bar I worked in bars for 20 some odd years, was made around alcohol. But this particular day, I went and ate, but I made a kind of a grave mistake for me. And I didn't get a drink in me that morning until as it turns out, it was too late. Walking home from that breakfast, my chest and my left arm started to go numb, and my chest started to lock up in a way that it previously hadn't. It was really serious, and I knew kind of that the jig was up. When you've watched 30,000 hours of television with a drink in your hand, as I had over the years, you become a medical expert.
That's right.
I don't know if you knew that, but
I'm not a doctor, but I play one on TV.
Exactly. I was playing one on TV that day, and I knew what was going on. So, and I also knew that I needed to call 911 because it was real serious. But when I got home, I think you can predict what I did before I called 911. That's the level of I had a drink. Needed a drink. So I took a drink and I called 911, and they took me to the hospital and did a cardiac intervention on me where they go up through your aorta, through your groin and aorta, and they placed a stent in my heart and saved my life. And I had expressed in the ambulance and wanted to stop. And post-surgery, I was up in the cardiac intensive care ward, and my sister and my mother are standing there. Now, these are two women who have watched collectively, their husband and father die. And now they've got the baby child. I was no baby at the time. I was 43 years old, but I'm laying there, obviously in a very compromised position. I've got the oxygen in and IVs in both arms, and they've got me compressed to the bed because I had a big hematoma from the surgery site. And so they had me in a compression bed where I couldn't really move. I wasn't strapped down, but essentially I was nailed to the bed in a fashion. And the woman from the HCMC chemical dependency unit came in and said, "Mr. Bale, you indicated that you've wanted some help with your alcoholism." And in that moment, what came out of my mouth was, "Oh, that's okay. I got this." And it makes me think of page 24 of our book in the italics where it says, you have no effective mental defense against the first drink, and says that the suffering of even a week or a month ago isn't sufficient. Well, in my case, apparently it's about the suffering of even an hour and a half ago. And my mind has the capacity to wipe that out. And I left that hospital a day and a half later and picked up a drink immediately and began to display even behavior that even my insane alcoholic mind couldn't rationalize. I have medicine that's going to save my life in one hand every morning, and I'm washing it down with a tumbler full of whiskey every day. And it's got those big orange labels on the bottles, on the prescriptions bottles, the ones that say "do not take with alcohol," that everybody that's an alcoholic takes with alcohol. So that's right.
I understand.
And so there was a 9-month period of this where I knew that if I continued to drink, I was going to die, but I couldn't stop drinking. And I believe that I really began to have the essence of my first step experience in those 9 months. I had some indication that I was powerless over alcohol, but you weren't going to convince me that my life was unmanageable, because I was always able to keep a roof over my head, even if I was lying, cheating, stealing, and to do it. I kept up appearances. I guess, in some terms you could call me a functional alcoholic, although I don't know how well I was functioning. But at that point, it was pretty obvious to me that I was in some trouble.
Okay, Patrick. So that was the 9-month period between when you had your heart attack and when you got sober, from April 2003 up until when you got sober up at December 22nd. So, was there anything? Do you remember your first meeting on December 22nd?
I remember my first meeting very vividly. On December 18th of 2003. The last month of my drinking, I had been sitting at my kitchen table with a loaded shotgun and a bottle of whiskey, kind of trying to find that golden spot where I could I could get that thing in my mouth and do what I never really wanted to do. I was one of those guys that would tell you he wanted to kill himself, but the truth is I just wanted the pain to stop. I really didn't want to die. I just didn't want to drink anymore. And for about that last month, and you got to remember, John, this last year of this is really kind of hazy for me. A lot of this has been reported to me. It's not really recall, because I was in sort of an extended blackout, not necessarily even from intoxication, but just the despondency and the depression of where I was. My sister reported to me that on the 18th of December in 2003 that I had placed a call to my older brother. And he came over, and he was I had mentioned earlier, he was a Vietnam War vet. So he immediately cleared the shotgun from the room, and cleared the gun out of it because it was loaded, and called her. And, my assumption at the time was that they were both going to help me. And in my sick mind at the time, help would have been, a nice large check and a ride to the liquor store and a carton of cigarettes and a pat on the back and, a little bit of encouragement that, hey, you'll be okay. Well, my sister's been a member of Al-Anon since she was 18 years old, and she's well into her 60s now. So you can imagine the level of black beltedness that she was carrying at the time. And growing up in that alcoholic home, she and I were like peas and carrots. Both my brothers were out of the home when most of my father's really serious bad alcoholism was happening. And she and I caught the brunt of that. And we were like peas and carrots. You know, when it was her turn in the barrel, I'd stand for her. And when it was my turn in the barrel, she'd stand for me. And it was probably the only relationship in my life, John, that I wouldn't be able to just openly disregard if you told me that my drinking was a problem. And she looked me right in the eye and said at the time, what I thought was the cruelest thing in the world. But I now know, having done my amends with her, that it was one of the hardest things she's ever said to anyone. She said to me that night, "Patrick, if you don't do something about your drinking, I can never speak to you again." And I knew she meant it. I just knew she meant it. And I found myself with my coat on and I said, "Okay, you're running the show from here on out," which is something that I've never said to anyone. And she took me to the same inner city detox that my father had rotated in and out of some 25 times. And she dropped me off there and said, "You've got to ask in yourself. I'm not going to do it for you." And she drove away. And so I asked in because it was December 18th of 2003 and it was cold as hell outside in Minnesota. So I went up the elevator and they admitted me, and a man of my standing and accomplishment, you know, needs a certain level of accommodation. So I immediately began to complain about the nature of mine in that facility. And they asked me a nice question. They said, "Mr. Bill, would you like an upgrade to the quiet room?" And I said, "It's about time somebody started paying attention to my needs." And they placed me in what essentially was a broom closet with sort of a urine smelling mat on the floor, and gave me a big hypo of something or other, and so I wouldn't seize up on them, and locked the door. There was a little observation slot in the door that would open up every hour and look and see if I was still breathing. But that was the extent that they wanted to deal with me and my needs that night. And the next morning, there was an audible knock on the door. And the next day, it would have been a Saturday, and it was in the afternoon. They said, "Patrick," or early evening, "Patrick, Alcoholics Anonymous is here. Do you want to go to the meeting?" Now, I wouldn't give you a plug nickel for AA at the time because I had watched my father rotate in and out of AA for many years, and he obviously died from the disease. So having an opinion about an experience I hadn't had yet, I just dismissed Alcoholics Anonymous as having any effect or good intention.
Do you remember any sort of feedback that your father had regarding his experience?
I do. In the 80s, I remember him and my mother talking about it. My mother would ask him, "John, how are the meetings?" And this was a time in Minnesota when the big book wasn't really actively engaged in AA. The treatment centers were blossoming. People were sitting in a circle and essentially having, group without a moderator, or with a psychotic moderator, a 3 months sober alcoholic or somebody as the GSR. And I remember him clearly saying that Francis, all they do is sit around and complain about their lives. And that's not something that my father would have done. He was a Depression era guy. He was a World War II vet. He wasn't somebody who was willing to listen to people sit around and tell you how bad it is when they drove up in a nice car and were wearing decent clothes and had something to eat. He grew up in a place in Minnesota where that wasn't always the case. He was poor as a kid and was a Depression era guy and a World War II guy. So, he had some sense of overblown values that wasn't for him. I'm sure at some point somebody that was trying to help him handed him a big book. My guess is he just thanked them and then put it in a drawer somewhere and never picked it up.
And that's very intriguing to me also, that you ended up in the same treatment center or whatever you want to call it, detoxing unit 20 plus times that he was there, or you weren't there. He was there 20 plus times. Well, how did you feel about it when you checked into there? I mean,
well, my sister had to pick him up there over many, many occasions. My mother's way of dealing with my father's alcoholism was to make my sister go get him. She being a full-blown Al-Anon herself, she would foist that upon my sister. And that's my sister's long since dealt with a lot of that. Thank God for Al-Anon. But I just, it was the only place she knew to take a drunk, honestly. And it was close. It was close to my house. It wasn't that far away. And it was Christmas week, and my sister had stuff to do, and she wasn't having it. She just said, "This is the place you're going." And I knew that that's the place that he had picked because I had been with a couple of times because she had to put me in the car and take me with because my mother would be intoxicated or whatever. So, as I said, alcohol was ravaging our family. So that night she dropped me off, and the next day, they knocked on the door, and 6 members of a group of Alcoholics Anonymous came, drove on a snowy night, 10 degrees and snowing. And I can't remember what was said in the meeting that night or who even was there. I just remember having one sort of obsessive thought: what the hell are these people doing here? Why would they voluntarily come to this stinkhole? Because it's an inner city detox, and it smelled like one, and wasn't a very pleasant place. It was a active, overly crowded detox unit in an inner city, and these people voluntarily came to carry a message of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I couldn't get the thought out of my head. Why would you do that? It's the stupidest thing I've ever heard of. And so I pulled one old boy aside after the meeting, and I apologize. I always get emotional when I think about this, but I said, "What are you doing here? Why the hell would you come here on your own?" And he looked at me with the softest blue eyes I've ever seen in my life. And he said, "Kid, I got a better deal out of this than you ever will." And something inside of me shifted just a bit. And so I asked the next question, and I said, I heard another really strange noise coming out of my mouth, and that was, "Well, how do you get that?" And he said, "Just keep coming." And so they had arranged a direct transfer from that detox unit to a treatment facility earlier in the day, which I had, willfully refused. And after that encounter with that gentleman, who I've never seen again, by the way.
Wow.
Just a responsible member of Alcoholics Anonymous, who was carrying the message that night. I went to the front desk and I said, I'll take that direct transfer. And so the following Monday morning, I was transferred to a 28-day inpatient treatment facility, in which the following day, at that intake, that counselor handed me the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous and introduced me to the recovery process known as the 12 steps. So,
all right. So let me do a little announcement here, then we'll get back. We will be continuing our conversation with Patrick B. in just a moment. Just a reminder, you were listening to Sober Speak. You can find us on the web at soberspeak.com. You can also find the donate button on our website if you wish to use it. If and only if the Spirit moves you. Keep in mind, this is a podcast funded by you, the listener. Sober Speak is a self-supporting organization through our own contributions. We are not allied with any sect, denomination, politics, organization, or institution. We do not wish to engage in any controversy, neither endorse nor oppose any causes. All right, now back to Mr. Patrick. All right, so you went to your first meeting. You got your first big book. Kind of take me from there.
Well, as I said, some members of Alcoholics Anonymous came into that 28-day inpatient treatment facility. And a guy that sounded like he knew what he was talking about, I found attractive. And I said, can you explain to me what this book's about? And he said, "What you're asking me to do is to sponsor you." So he just began to explain to me the nature of the process from the beginning. And he says, "What we'll do is I'll come here once a week and we'll sit down and we'll go through this book, and you'll take all the actions that are indicated in the print, and you'll have an experience that will help you stay sober and then allow you to go help other people," which I thought at the time obviously was absolute hogwash. All I wanted to do was get sober. I thought Alcoholics Anonymous was about receiving something. I didn't know that it was about learning how to give something away. But he, and I was in very difficult mental and physical condition, John. I was compromised physically. As I said, I was dying. So I had some very struggled, when Bill writes about his first 6 months and some of the depression, and I can identify with that. I had a lot of physical struggles. I had a lot of mental struggles, and I needed to be in facilities. They sent me to a 90-day relapse prevention program, which was essentially sober living with a high level of structure after that 28-day treatment, because I didn't have anywhere to go. You know, I owed $5,000 in back rent, and as soon as I got out of the place, as soon as I went to treatment, you know, they packed my stuff up and put it in my mom's basement and said, you know, good riddance. You know, I needed that 90-day bed. And then from there, they recommended that I go to sober living. And I you know, having nowhere else to go, I agreed to that too. And I needed every minute of those structured environments and able to be put together a recovery routine. And you know, I started to go to 4 or 5 meetings a week. And I became sort of an enthusiastic member of Alcoholics Anonymous. It was really a time in my life when I could reorient myself to what it was I knew. I was struck with the spirit of service almost immediately, and you know, I wanted to be helpful. I began to have an experience post-inventory with the work that indicated to me that my life needed to be dedicated to the service of others, and so I did that. You know, early on in that process of sober living, having this orientation, I decided that I would seek employment, and having been unemployable for about the last 5 years of my drinking, I realized pretty quickly that I had very limited skills to operate in the world. I was a high school dropout. So I woke up at 44 years old with no marketable job skill, no education, and a very serious case of post-acute withdrawal and alcoholism. And Alcoholics Anonymous really put me back on my feet and allowed me to begin to get my education. I got my GED while I was living in that sober house, and I started college while I was there as well. And I also started working in the treatment business. I went back to that 90-day treatment facility and got a job as a CD tech. My first job at 45 years old as a member of Alcoholics Anonymous was for $7.20 an hour. And I worked an overnight shift in a treatment center with where it was me, a set of keys, a telephone, and 30 guys in early recovery. And I started that job at 18 months sober. And at 18 months sober, I was a guy who would cheerfully beat you over the head with the big book. I was a bit too enthusiastic.
Yeah, I understand.
About the program. That being said, I think that enthusiasm is what initially kept me sober. I don't know how many, you know, I sponsored a lot of guys early on, and I don't know how many of them made it, but I know I did. So
I understand. You know, I've always said I'd rather people be a little too enthusiastic as opposed to less enthusiastic, because you can turn it back, but it's hard to ramp it up, so to speak.
And the early years of my recovery were interesting. You know, my mother was diagnosed with Alzheimer's when I was about 6 months sober. So that began that progression, and my sister was sort of in charge of that. But I was able to participate, and I was able to make amends with my mother, before, you know, her memory went too bad. So my relationship with her was restored to some degree, and I was able to participate at the level I was able to participate. I mean, I look back on it now and wish I could have done more. That being said, I did what I could at the time, as far as helping out with my mom. I was able to really help out with cleaning out her house when we moved her to a care facility. I was able to arrange some of that stuff and participate. And I remember my sister just being very grateful that I was finally sort of back a contributing member of the family. She did pass away when I was 2.5 years sober, and that was a difficult experience. And my health condition continued to sort of improve and then deteriorate. And at 5 years sober, it was determined that I needed a triple bypass. And I was able to navigate that process, where they split your sternum with a bone saw. I was able to navigate that process and do it sober. I was accountable about the pain meds. You know, I was able to put together a structure with my sponsor at the time and the doctors and all the people in that process. And I've had many medical procedures since, in which I've been able to navigate, you know, the world of pain medication successfully without abusing or overdosing. I think one of the most important things that I can say here today is that there's a perception that that pain medication is an issue for people in recovery. And what I would propose to you is that lack of accountability around pain medication is the problem in most cases. Is it inherently difficult? Yes, it is. But if you let somebody else manage the clock and the bottle of pills, you can take pain meds for as they're prescribed, for what they're prescribed, when they're prescribed, and you don't have to suffer needlessly.
That's right.
I think the problem is when I'm managing the clock, because I've got a watch that runs a little fast, and I also don't count. Two looks like 4 to me, and so that. But that's my little rant about pain medication.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So I want to turn a corner a little bit. I know I know about your background. I know a little bit about your background in that you were a member of another organization within another anonymous organization, Overeaters Anonymous.
I am.
And I know that you're involved in a group, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, called A Vision for You.
I am.
Okay. So talk to me a little. So here is really where I'm trying to bridge, and that is there are a lot of people who have difficulties, if you will, or struggles within Alcoholics Anonymous, and some of them are dying within the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous.
Absolutely.
And so I just want to get your perspective, your experience on that, how you made it into OA, and just your story in that arena.
I would love to share that with you. It turns out, John, that food was probably my first drug. I clearly remember getting caught stealing a candy bar out of a grocery store when I was about 4 years old, and most people would think that's just a mischievous kid. But I went back and figured out how to do it without getting caught, and I did it almost every day as long as I needed to. I had an addiction to sugar very early on in my life, and then I discovered beverage alcohol would do what I needed it to do, change my internal condition quicker. And I sort of did a combo dance with food and alcohol. Alcohol presented as the primary problem because it turns out when you get drunk, you do a bunch of stupid stuff. When you overeat, you just kind of go to sleep or do whatever. You don't do the dumb stuff. So alcohol was always assumed to be my problem, but I had a problem with food and weight my whole life. I was always about 50 to 60 pounds overweight.
And was that part of the triple bypass?
Yes, absolutely. And post triple bypass, I remember very clearly in the recovery room thinking, well, I can't drink anymore, but now I can eat whatever I want. And I began to do that with some enthusiasm, addictive enthusiasm. And I put on in the next 6 years, after a triple bypass, I put on 150 pounds. Now, I don't know any cardiologists that recommend adding 150 pounds to a post bypass recovery process, but that's the way it ended up looking for me. And in 2015, I was at the International Alcoholics Anonymous convention, weighing 385 pounds and unable to really navigate the convention center in Atlanta, which was huge, just a giant place. Successfully on my feet. I couldn't walk more than 500 or 1,000 feet at a time without needing to rest. But if you ask me at the time, and if you ask me during that period of time in the rooms how I was doing, my report to you would be that I'm fine. I'm fine. I'm fine. And the truth is that my spiritual condition was degrading. I wasn't practicing the principles of 10, 11, and 12 in my life with any sort of rigor. If things got really bad, I'd shoot out a quick inventory and call my sponsor, but I didn't really have a prayer and meditative life. I was carrying the message because that made me appear to be a responsible AA member. And for me, I'm the actor who leads a double life, and I can do that in Alcoholics Anonymous. I think we've got rooms full of people who are attached to their time. And the time can be the enemy of the alcoholic, in my opinion, in my experience. I got hooked to the idea that I had multiple years and double-digit years, and that I wasn't supposed to be suffering or struggling with anything. I was supposed to represent something other than just being a garden variety alcoholic who may have other struggles. So at the 2015 International AA Convention, I was sitting on a bench, sweating profusely and kind of wheezing from having efforted some walk. And an acquaintance of mine who I'd met at many conventions over the years approached me, and we hugged, and her husband was there, and he said, "Hey, sit with her for a minute. I'm going to go get us some coffee and a sandwich for those two." I had just finished a pizza by myself or something. I don't know what, but anyway. So she sat down with me, and she looked at me and she asked me how I was doing. And I said, fine. And, she looked me straight in the eye and said, you're full of bleep. And I broke right there. And she began to 12-step me into the fellowship of Overeaters Anonymous. At the time, I didn't know that she was a member of Alcoholic or Overeaters Anonymous. I had always assumed she was an AA person, but she came to AA convention because she liked to talk about the big book. She liked the enthusiasm. She liked the fellowship, and her husband was a member of Alcoholics Anonymous in recovery. But she was a member of this fellowship called Overeaters Anonymous. She told me about A Vision for You, which is a big book, an online and on phone big book meeting that happens on a daily basis, 7 days a week. It's a very vibrant speaker-based meeting in which they typically get somewhere in the neighborhood of 300 to 700 participants on a daily basis, depending on which call you get on. There's 2 different times. It's A Vision for You. OA, A Vision for You is the website. If you just Google that, you'll find it. And it's a big book based part of the fellowship. And every 2 years they have a convention. The way I was introduced to you is through a tape. I was asked to speak at their convention a little over a year ago.
Yep, and Mary Jo got me in contact with you.
Yep, and Mary Jo got, Kathy Jo, I think, got you.
Kathy Jo, I apologize, yes.
Kathy Jo got you in touch with me based on that recording. But I went home from that encounter, and initially, of course, like any good addict or alcoholic, I resisted taking direction. And I overate. I continued to just eat the way I'd been eating for about another month. And then I hit a level of desperation around it that was similar to the bottom that I hit with alcohol. I knew I was killing myself. By this time, I developed type 2 diabetes in a pretty serious way. And the medical indicators were that I was, on my way to dying. And again, I'll say to you, John, I'm a guy that will report to you that I want to die, but the truth is that I don't want to die. I just want the pain to stop. And food had helped me treat my internal condition after I had some grief. At year 4, I had a couple of sponsees die. Year 2.5, I had my mother die. At year 7, I had my brother die in my arms. I had some unresolved stuff that I was just trying to tough out. And I thought working the steps would treat everything. Well, what working the steps does is keep us sober and allow us to go out to these other qualified people in the world to deal with maybe some of the other stuff. And I wasn't doing that. And that's why I think the food was so prominent in my life. So back to how I got into OA, I came home, and it turns out my home group's about 1.5 miles from my house. I'm in a version of Alcoholic or Overeaters Anonymous called OA How, which is a very rigorous, big book based version of it. We adhere very strictly to a food plan that's given to us by a nutritionist. I report my food on a daily basis. I do an assignment out of the AA literature every day that I report to my sponsor. And if anybody on this podcast is ever interested in understanding more about that, you can ask John for my contact information, and I'm happy to share it with you.
That's right, and I'll forward it on. So I'm about to dive into an area that I know very little about. I know enough to be dangerous, so to speak, but aren't there, how do you put this, various methodologies within OA of how you actually work that program?
There are what we call traditional Overeaters Anonymous, which is sort of the traditional thing. And the interesting thing about this, John, is that it turns out that you can't stop eating. really bad stuff happens to you if you just stop eating. In Alcoholics Anonymous, we get to stop drinking,
Right.
so we can eliminate the problem. In Overeaters Anonymous, you have to, as we like to say, we have to walk the tiger 3 times a day.
Right.
And you got to make sure that tiger doesn't jump you. So for me, I do a version called OA How, which is very, very rigid and very strict, tool-based thing that's all based on the information in the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous. There are several different forms of OA. I'm not as familiar. I walked right into How. How appealed to me because it was so rigid and disciplined and structured. It removed any questions about what I was going to eat. I get to eat 6 times a day. I actually eat a volume of food that's more than what I ate when I was gaining weight. It's just different, better food. But we actively work with a nutritionist. I have a nutritionist that does my food plan with me every 3 months. We review it. And I don't put anything in my mouth that I'm not accountable to my sponsor in OA for. Not all forms of Overeaters Anonymous are that rigid. Because of the way different people react to different foods, some people can manage what they take in. Some members of Overeaters Anonymous can even successfully navigate sugar. I am not one of those people. I am an avowed sugar addict. You put sugar in me and it has the same effect that a shot of liquor does. I think Bob D out of Las Vegas put it as once that I put for me, drinking or overeating is like having sex with a gorilla. We're not done until the gorilla says we are.
That's right.
So for me, sugar, if I put sugar in my system, I'm not done until the sugar says I'm done. And so it's the same action that I have with alcohol. Not everybody has that level of sensitivity. So it's a bit of a dance for some people to find a version of OA that they like. What I would say to you is that if you're struggling with any sort of an eating disorder, be it anorexia, be it bulimia, be it overeating, be it obesity, be it binge eating, be it sugar addiction, whatever it may be, Overeaters Anonymous has a viable solution for you. And to just begin to explore that. There is a website, just like with AA, there's a international website, a national website. Its structure is taken much from OA. At the beginning of Overeaters Anonymous, Rose, who is one of the founders, had a lot of interactions with the men who began Gamblers Anonymous. As a matter of fact, that's because she didn't want to go to AA because of she believed that initially the addiction was a process addiction, like gambling is, that there's this action we take. So that's how and in fits and starts it started. You can look into the history at your leisure, but yes, you're right. There are several different ways to manage a food plan in Overeaters Anonymous. But it's all based on the 12 steps and 12 traditions of AA. It is fundamentally, it's a 12-step fellowship. The difference is that we do have to eat. So there are some different parameters that we have to approach.
Yes. So talk to me a little bit when you have a date, so to speak, in Overeaters Anonymous, and do you have a date in OA as well?
I do. My abstinence date is my back-to-back abstinence. I entered Overeaters Anonymous How on August 10th of 2015. While I was hospitalized last year, I had a slip. So my back-to-back abstinence date in OA, I was able to get right back on the train the next day, fortunately for me. My back-to-back abstinence date in OA How is August 20th of 2018.
Okay, so
that's what we call our sobriety in
right.
Overeaters Anonymous is abstinence from overeating.
Okay, so abstinence from overeating, does that mean you kind of evaluate what your triggers are, and then as long as you stay away from those particular triggers like sugar or whatever it is, that is your date?
That can be part of it. For me, I very specifically weigh and measure everything I eat. Now that sounds like a lot of work. It's really very easy. Like today, I read my menu to my sponsor this morning. And I eat 6 times a day. I have 3 meals and 3 snacks, 3 healthy snacks. And I very specifically weigh and measure all the food that I eat because that's what works for me. Other people can eat just a meal. They can eyeball what they put on their plate. That I'm not one of those people. It turns out, like I said, my counter is a little off. What looks like 4 ounces to you um, would probably look like half an ounce to me. What looks like 4 ounces to me is a 16-ounce sirloin. So that speaks to sort of that internal brokenness around the food. It's very, very similar to, I always thought a shot of whiskey came in a bottle with a handle on it, right?
Right.
So it's kind of the same way with food for me. So abstinence is declared by members of Overeaters Anonymous in many different ways. I adhere to how, and how is very specific in what it asks of its members. It is a very disciplined and rigid way to do OA, but it is also one of the most effective at losing. I lost 170 pounds and have kept it off for, the better part of 2 years.
That's fantastic.
So,
yeah.
I went from 385 pounds down to 215. My type 2 diabetes is in full remission. All my other health numbers, I was on the maximum dose of those heart medications that I still have to take today post-surgery. I am now on the lowest recommended dose of each of those medications. And more importantly, I think I've achieved a level of spiritual fitness through working this rigorous 10, 11, and 12 process that we do in OA How. That is different. I thought I had reached some spiritual fitness in AA. I was mistaken. I now know what it feels like to be truly free and to have a meaningful, fulfilling relationship with a power greater than myself, and to be fully present to my life and to other people's lives, more importantly. It's improved my ability to effectively execute my profession. It's allowed me to get a master's this May at 59 years old. I know I couldn't be doing that if I was still in the food, as they say. So this, I really believe it was my manifest destiny to be a member of 2 fellowships. It's not something I recommend to anybody. If you think me having to go to OA at 11 years sober in AA was my idea, you're out of your mind. And if you think I wasn't a little cranky about it for about 6 months, you're out of your mind. But I went because I knew they had something that I wanted, which was that freedom that they spoke of. I am an active member of both fellowships. I have maintained my good standing in both fellowships, and what that looks like is I have a home group in each that I attend each week. I sponsor people in each. I read the big book with other people in each, and I participate in efforts like this to carry the message in each.
Very nice.
Yeah.
So one other question. That picture behind you?
Yes.
What is that picture?
That is a photograph of Miles Davis.
That's who that is.
Yes. The very famous jazz trumpeter who is one of my heroes. I'm a big music aficionado. And that's a photo. I've had that. Oh God. I bet I've had that for at least 30 years. And it was taken by Anton Corbin, which is the name across the top. But yeah, it's a photograph of Miles Davis.
Yeah, I love the photo. It definitely draws you in.
Yes,
you just something to think about.
Those eyes, Miles had quite a gaze. And if he shot that gaze at you, you knew something was up. But yeah, he was one of my heroes. I was able to see him play live on a number of occasions as a younger man. So I'm grateful that I have that.
So on a more personal note, what would be one thing you believe that people may not know about you that may be something they would like to know?
That at my core, what recovery did for me was bring out the innocence of a helpful little boy. Little kids want to help each other, right? They have a natural, they can be mean, but they can be there's always this help. I had a helpfulness when I was a young kid, and alcoholism beat that down. and what it's done for me is bring out that enthusiastic, helpful boy. I'm of service in a number of different ways in my life. I'm in service at my college. I'm in service in my work. I sleep in the service of others. I have a little overnight side hustle job that I do that where I actually sleep in a mental health facility for emergency calls. I'm just able to be that I really love being of service and helping other people, not just in my fellowships as an idea of rote, but that really that's where my heart is that what I receive when I'm in the service of another human being is greater than anything that I've ever found. And I think that that's what I would like people to know, that if you're willing to dig down in this thing and find yourself, what you'll find is a heart that's willing to give. And when you give, you receive at a high level.
God bless you, Patrick. This has been a most enjoyable conversation.
Thank you, John.
I know that
as well.
Good. I know that the listeners in all corners of the world are going to enjoy this. I sure do appreciate you coming on today. God bless you, my friend.
You're welcome.
So what'd you think about Mr. Patrick there? I think he is an incredible soul with an incredible spirit, and I just so did appreciate spending time with him. So feel free to reach out to me at John, John, at soberspeak.com. I would love to hear from you about Patrick and or any of the other speakers. So now let's get on to a little bit of listener feedback and wrap this one up for the week. Tracy writes in on Instagram. She says, listen to you every night since I found you. Love the format. Sober 9 years and just started going to meetings in November. Hello from Phoenix. Tracy, well, sober 9 years and just started going to meetings. I would love to hear what life is like either before and after going to meetings and what that first 9 years was like, Miss Tracy. Write back to me. Let me know. All right. Beverly writes in and she says, hi, John. Just listen to Gary K. All I can say is wow. W-O-W in all cap letters with an exclamation point. I was mesmerized. I will be listening to him again and again, and maybe after that, exclamation point. Anyway, yeah, Gary K is quite the treat. I'm so glad you enjoyed listening to Gary, Beverly. Matt S. writes in, and Matt says, my name is Matthew S. 2 years ago, I was married, 3 kids, a house, and all the nice things that went with it. Today, I am divorced, have my kids 50% of the time, and I'm living in an apartment. I just recently got a job, and I am honestly 11 days sober. Oh, wow, Matt. I was sober prior for almost a month, but had 1 beer. I was so mad at myself for starting over, and I'm done. With my divorce and losing my job, I went back into a deep spin of alcoholism. My alcoholism was always there, but it ramped up and dumped me right on my head on the way to a rock bottom. I am new to AA and your podcast. I'm starting with the AA meetings, and I'm also part of a Dad's Alliance group that helps me tremendously. I am excited about the future. Your podcast helps me until I can get to the, quote, next meeting, unquote, when I have my kids or I can't get away. I found your podcast in a search for AA. I live in La Habra, H-A-B-R-A, hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, California, and I work in Orange County. Matt S. Well, Matt S., I'm excited for your future as well. Thank you for the honesty. Thank you for the vulnerability. And God bless you. Please keep me posted. Jorge writes in, and sometimes I see Jorge pronounced as George nowadays. It's either Jorge or George, J-O-R-G-E. But anyway, he writes in, he says, John, I live in Jacksonville, Florida. I got sober in Springfield, Massachusetts. Sobriety date is May 16th, 2008. I'm an active member of AA. I have went through the 12 steps as laid out as laid out in the big book with the sponsor, and I work 10, 11, and 12 on a daily basis. I found SoberSpeak when one of my Facebook friends shared it on their profile. Jorge. Well, that is fantastic, Jorge. I am glad everything is working out from you. I like how pithy you are with your message, and I'm glad things are working out for you. All right, Janice writes in. So, I have some listener feedback for the podcast from Ken H. I really like the show where he said, for us, the process of gaining a new perspective is unbelievably painful in sobriety. The turmoil that comes out of the nature of huge emotional rearrangements and displacements can be tough. Spiritual growth is turbulent. It's our higher power taking us where we need to be. I've listened to that a few times now, and it's exactly what I'm going through. Thank you so much for doing this podcast. It has helped me out so much. Janice P. Well, thanks for writing in, Janice P., and I will pass along your good words to Mr. Ken H. Carol writes in, I'm 5 months sober and working the steps with my sponsor. I live in Sultan, Washington, and I spend a lot of time traveling with my husband, helping charities and civility. Due to not being able to always make it to a meeting, I asked others, and I found out some ideas about how to keep me sober, and SoberSpeak was brought to my attention. I have listened to a few of the episodes, and I'm thankful you added me to the Facebook group. Thank you, Carol. Well, the pleasure is all mine, Miss Carol. I'm glad you were able to join that Facebook group. All right, everybody. So that's a wrap for this week. We'll probably see you next week. I always say, for me, this is 1 week at a time. Now, I've been saying that now for 70 plus weeks, and I've always been able to get out an episode, but I guess I'll have an episode out next week. We'll just take it 1 week at a time, just like I take my sobriety 1 day at a time. God bless you and keep you until then. Bye-bye.